What happens when one of Hollywood's most uncompromising directors sits across from a talk show host who thinks he can control the narrative? What you're about to witness is the most explosive late-night television meltdown ever captured on camera, a clash between two titans that would leave one man's reputation in tatters and the other walking off stage in a fury that shocked millions of viewers. The tension was palpable from the moment Quentin Tarantino walked onto Stephen Colbert's set. Something was different about this interview, something that the audience couldn't quite put their finger on. Colbert's usual warm smile seemed forced, almost predatory, as he adjusted his tie and leaned back in his chair with an air of superiority that veteran Hollywood observers would later describe as deeply unsettling. As Tarantino settled into his guest chair, running his hands through his hair in that familiar nervous gesture, Colbert didn't waste time with pleasantries. Instead, he launched into what appeared to be a carefully orchestrated attack disguised as journalism. "Quentin, let's talk about your latest film," Colbert began, his voice carrying an edge that immediately put the director on guard. "Critics are saying it's just another exercise in gratuitous violence. Some are calling it pornographic. How do you respond to people who say you've completely lost your artistic integrity?" The question hung in the air like a loaded gun. Tarantino's eyes narrowed, his jaw tightening as he processed what had just happened. This wasn't the typical softball interview he'd been expecting. This was an ambush. "Well, Stephen," Tarantino replied, his voice measured but with a hint of steel, "I think those critics fundamentally misunderstand what cinema is supposed to do. My films aren't about violence for violence's sake. They're about exploring the human condition through extreme circumstances." But Colbert wasn't interested in a thoughtful discussion. He leaned forward, his smile becoming more of a smirk. "Come on, Quentin. Let's be honest here. You've made a career out of shocking people. At what point does shock value become a substitute for actual storytelling? When did you decide that blood and gore were more important than character development?" The audience shifted uncomfortably in their seats. This wasn't the Stephen Colbert they knew, the charming host who usually made his guests feel welcome. This was something else entirely, something darker and more calculating. Tarantino's hands began to gesture more animatedly, a sure sign that his famous temper was beginning to simmer. "Look, I don't know what kind of interview you think you're conducting here, but you're asking loaded questions based on false premises. My films have more character development in 5 minutes than most movies have in their entire runtime. False premises?" Colbert laughed, but there was no warmth in it. "Quentin, I've done my research. I've talked to people in the industry. There are serious questions about your methods, about the way you treat actors on set, about your obsession with certain controversial themes. Don't you think the public deserves answers?" The director's face began to flush with anger. "What people are you talking to? What research? You're making accusations without backing them up. This is supposed to be an interview, not a trial." Colbert's eyes gleamed with something that looked disturbingly like satisfaction. "I'm just asking the questions that everyone's thinking, Quentin. The uncomfortable questions that other interviewers are too afraid to ask. Isn't that what good journalism is about?" "Good journalism?" Tarantino's voice rose slightly, drawing concerned glances from the production crew. "Good journalism involves research, context, and fairness. What you're doing is character assassination disguised as inquiry." The host leaned back in his chair, clearly enjoying the director's discomfort. "You know, Quentin, for someone who's built a career on controversy, you seem awfully sensitive to criticism. Maybe that says something about the validity of the criticism itself." This was the moment when everything changed. Tarantino's famous composure finally cracked, and the raw emotion that had been building throughout the interview began to spill over. His hands were shaking now, not with nervousness, but with barely controlled rage. "Sensitive to criticism?" Tarantino's voice cracked with indignation. "I've been dealing with criticism my entire career, but there's a difference between legitimate criticism and what you're doing here. You're twisting my words, misrepresenting my work, and ambushing me with questions designed to make me look bad, rather than actually explore anything meaningful. About cinema or art? Colbert's mask slipped for just a moment, revealing something cold and calculating underneath. Maybe the problem isn't the questions, Quentin. Maybe the problem is that you can't handle being held accountable for your choices. As a filmmaker, the audience was completely silent now, sensing that they were witnessing something unprecedented. The cameras continued to roll, capturing every moment of what was quickly becoming the most uncomfortable interview in late-night television history. The tension in the studio had become suffocating. Production assistants exchanged worried glances, while the camera operators continued filming, unsure whether they should keep rolling or cut to commercial. But Stephen Colbert wasn't finished. If anything, Tarantino's visible anger seemed to energize him, like a predator that had finally cornered its prey. Accountability, Quentin. That's all this is about, Colbert continued, his voice dripping with false sincerity. You see, I've been talking to some very credible sources in Hollywood. People who've worked with you. People who know the real story. Behind your so-called artistic vision. Tarantino's eyes flashed dangerously. What sources? Name them. If you're going to make accusations, have the guts to back them up with specifics instead of hiding behind anonymous gossip. Colbert waved his hand dismissively, as if Tarantino's demand was unreasonable. You know I can't reveal my sources, Quentin. But what I can tell you is that there's a pattern here. A pattern of behavior that suggests maybe your reputation as this brilliant auteur is built on something far less admirable than people think. The director leaned forward in his chair, his voice dropping to a dangerous whisper that somehow carried more menace than shouting. You want to talk about patterns, Stephen? Let's talk about the pattern of hack talk show hosts who think they're journalists. Let's talk about the pattern of ambush interviews designed to generate controversy rather than explore ideas. You're not Edward R. Murrow, you're just another television parasite feeding off other people's work. For the first time, Colbert's composure cracked slightly. A flash of genuine anger crossed his face before he recovered his smug demeanor. That's rich, coming from someone whose entire career is built on recycling other people's ideas. How many of your films are just homages to better directors? How much of your dialogue is lifted from movies you watched as a kid? The accusation hit Tarantino like a physical blow. His face went white, then red, as he processed what Colbert had just said. This wasn't just an attack on his latest film anymore. This was an assault on his entire body of work, his identity as an artist, everything he'd spent decades building. You have no idea what you're talking about, Tarantino said, his voice shaking with fury. Homage isn't theft. Influence isn't plagiarism. Every artist builds on what came before. But you wouldn't understand that because you've never created anything original in your life. You're a comedy writer who got lucky enough to land a television show. Colbert's smile became razor-sharp. At least I don't hide behind pretension and violence to mask my lack of genuine insight. At least I don't need to shock people into paying attention because I can't hold their interest with actual talent. The words hung in the air like poison gas. Several audience members gasped audibly. Even the most seasoned television veterans in the control room knew they were witnessing something that would end careers and destroy reputations. Tarantino slowly rose from his chair, his entire body trembling with rage. You want to talk about talent, Stephen? You want to talk about holding people's interest? Let me tell you something about talent. Talent is creating something that matters, something that challenges people, something that makes them think and feel and question their assumptions about the world. What you do isn't talent. It's manufactured charm. It's focus-grouped entertainment designed to make people feel smart, without actually having to think. Colbert remained seated, but his knuckles were white as he gripped the arms of his chair. Manufactured charm? That's funny, coming from someone whose every public appearance is a carefully calculated performance designed to maintain his image as this maverick filmmaker. Tell me, Quentin, when was the last time you said anything in public that wasn't designed to promote your brand? The director's voice rose to a roar that could be heard clearly in the back rows of the studio audience. My brand? My brand is making films that matter. My brand is refusing to compromise my vision for people like you who think art should be safe and sanitized and pre-approved by focus groups. You sit there in your comfortable chair, protected by your writers and your producers and your network executives, taking cheap shots at people who actually put themselves on the line to create something meaningful. Colbert finally stood up, abandoning any pretense of maintaining his host persona. Meaningful? You call exploitation films meaningful? You call graphic violence and juvenile dialogue meaningful? The only thing you've ever put on the line is other people's money, and you've been fortunate enough to find investors stupid enough to fund your adolescent fantasies. The studio erupted. Audience members were shouting, some cheering, others booing. Security personnel began moving toward the stage. The camera operators looked to their director for guidance, but everyone seemed frozen by the unprecedented nature of what was unfolding before them. Tarantino pointed an accusatory finger at Colbert, his voice cutting through the chaos like a knife. You know what your problem is, Stephen? You're jealous. You're jealous because I create and you just comment. You're jealous because people will remember my films long after your show is canceled and forgotten. You're jealous because you know that everything you've achieved is built on other people's work, other people's ideas, other people's talent. Colbert's mask finally fell away completely, revealing the cold, calculating individual that had been lurking beneath the surface all along. Jealous? Of what? Of being a has-been who peaked 20 years ago? Of being a director whose last 3 films were commercial failures? Of being so desperate for relevance that you'll do anything, say anything, to stay in the headlines? The words hit Tarantino like a sledgehammer to the chest. Commercial failures. Has been. Desperate for relevance. For a moment, the director stood completely still, as if processing the full weight of what Colbert had just said. The studio fell into an eerie silence, broken only by the hum of camera equipment and the distant sound of producers frantically speaking into their headsets. Then something snapped inside Quentin Tarantino. Commercial failures? Tarantino's voice started low, almost conversational, but there was something terrifying in its controlled calm. You want to talk about commercial failures, Stephen? Let's talk about your credibility. Let's talk about what happens when a talk show host decides he's more important than his guests. Let's talk about what happens when someone gets so drunk on their own power that they forget their place in the entertainment ecosystem. Colbert tried to interject, but Tarantino was just getting started. The floodgates had opened, and 25 years of dealing with hostile interviews, bad faith criticism, and media manipulation came pouring out in a torrent of righteous fury. You sit there behind your desk like some kind of judge, like you have the authority to determine what has value and what doesn't. But what have you ever created, Stephen? What have you ever put into the world that wasn't derivative, that wasn't committee approved, that wasn't designed by market research? You're a parasite. You're a remora fish attached to the belly of actual artists, feeding off their work while contributing nothing of substance yourself. The director began pacing now, his energy building like a storm system gaining strength. Security personnel had moved closer but seemed unsure whether to intervene. This wasn't physical violence, but it was something perhaps more dangerous. A complete dismantling of everything Stephen Colbert represented. And you want to talk about desperation? Let's talk about desperation, Stephen. Let's talk about a man so desperate to seem relevant, so desperate to seem important, that he'll ambush a guest on his own show. Let's talk about someone so insecure about his own lack of artistic achievement that he has to tear down people who actually create things. This isn't journalism, Stephen. This isn't even entertainment. This is therapy. This is you working out your own failures and inadequacies. At my expense. Colbert's face had gone completely white. Whatever he had planned for this interview, it clearly wasn't this. He tried to regain control, his voice shaking slightly as he spoke. Quentin, I think you're having some kind of breakdown here. Maybe we should take a commercial break and let you collect yourself. The condescension in Colbert's voice was the final straw. Tarantino whirled around to face him directly, his eyes blazing with an intensity that made several audience members actually recoil in their seats. A breakdown? A breakdown would be sitting here and letting you continue this character assassination. A breakdown would be pretending that what you're doing is acceptable behavior from someone in your position. What I'm having, Stephen, is a moment of clarity. I'm seeing you for exactly what you are, and I'm done pretending otherwise. The director moved closer to Colbert's desk, not threateningly, but with the focused intensity of someone making a point that needed to be made. You know what the real tragedy is here, Stephen? You actually had talent once. You were genuinely funny. You had something to offer the world. But somewhere along the way, you decided that tearing other people down was easier than building something up. You decided that cynicism was safer than creativity. You decided that being a critic was more important than being an artist. Colbert tried one last time to regain his composure, to salvage something from the wreckage of what was supposed to be a routine interview. Quentin, I think you're taking this way too personally. This is just the nature of these kinds of conversations. It's nothing personal. Tarantino laughed, but there was no humor in it whatsoever. Nothing personal? Nothing personal? Stephen, you've spent the last 20 minutes attacking everything I've worked for my entire career. You've questioned my integrity, my talent, my motivations, and my relevance. You've made accusations without evidence and passed judgment without understanding. And now you want to pretend it's nothing personal? The director shook his head in disgust and began walking toward the edge of the stage. You know what, Stephen? I'm done here. I'm done with this conversation. I'm done with this show, and I'm done with people like you who think that having a platform gives you the right to destroy other people's reputations for your own entertainment. As Tarantino reached the steps leading off the stage, he turned back one final time to deliver a parting shot that would be replayed millions of times across social media and news programs for weeks to come. The saddest part about all of this, Stephen, is that you could have had a real conversation tonight. You could have explored ideas. You could have discussed art. You could have actually contributed something meaningful to the cultural dialogue. Instead, you chose to be exactly what's wrong with media today. You chose to be a destroyer instead of a creator. You chose to be forgettable. With that, Quentin Tarantino walked off the set of The Late Show, leaving Stephen Colbert sitting, alone at his desk, staring at the empty guest chair while the studio audience sat in stunned silence. The cameras continued rolling, capturing every second of Colbert's humiliation, as he struggled to find words, any words, that might salvage the moment. But there were no words. The damage was done. The mask had been ripped away, and millions of viewers had just witnessed the complete and utter destruction of everything Stephen Colbert had spent years building. As the credits finally rolled and the show cut to commercial, one thing was crystal clear. This was a night that would change everything, and there would be no going back.